Well, welcome to the panel. I told Laurel I had a lot of experience winging it, and that's what we're going to do.
We are.
Because we have two participants who are going to Skype in, but we're having technical difficulties right now, so we will proceed with the program. My name is Robert Montjoy, and I'll introduce the others in just a second. The panel is very much in keeping with the theme of the whole conference, you know, about integrity, confidence in government, et cetera, because if a purported democracy can't pull off elections properly, that's certainly going to have a bad situation for confidence in government. So elections have to work and have to be perceived to work. So the important issues all over the world, and certainly plenty in this country, as we all know. So we're going to have, the original order was, I'll give you that order and then we'll shift. Avery Davis Roberts from the Carter Center is going to talk about election standards. Pippa Norris from Harvard and the Electoral Integrity Project is going to talk about performance measures in a worldwide context. Chad Vickery from IFAS would talk, and Bridget King from Auburn University. Each are going to present examples of projects, in both cases from Africa. And Doug Chapin will play cleanup hitter and bring it all together at the end. And I'm hoping we'll have some time for discussion with each other up here and with the audience about the presentations. So thank you, and let's get started. And let's go ahead and, are you telling me that?
I'll come on to the mobile if you don't mind.
Well,
So if you have any problems, right?
So
she's absolutely sure.
are they going first?
yeah, she can go first if we can get her. Let's go. Belay my last. We're going back in.
Marvelous. We were just worried we were not going to be able to connect for some reason, so we all tried phoning each other. But the only person I managed to speak to was Avery, who was in Atlanta. So we didn't manage to connect properly.
Now, can you put her up there?
No, I'm working on that.
Okay.
Can you turn up 4?
Yeah. Yep.
Oh, it's not wanting to talk. Okay. So I'll go ahead and just do fashion. Just move like the speaker.
Hi, Peppa.
How are you? Everything good?
Most everything. You guys are going to tell us what's good around the world.
We'll do something, we'll try. And I've got my share screen ready to go, so I can easily show that if everything's being projected.
Okay, you're on a little out of focus, but you're on the big screen up here. And
Okay.
are we ready to go, folks? Okay, take it away.
We're ready to start?
Yes, I've already introduced it while we were trying to get connected. But
So
you've gone away right now.
Can you now see my screen?
Yes.
Brilliant. So let me talk just a little bit then about what I thought I'd focus on for today. And obviously our panel, preparing to serve democracy, a big task, and electoral administration. And what I'd like to do is talk about 3 things. Number 1, when we think about policy schools, what can and should be taught about electoral integrity, and how can we think about that issue? Number 2, why do we need to integrate this topic now into the curriculum, since it hasn't been included that much in the past? And then if there's any time left, let me know what is the Electoral Integrity Project, just as an example of how we might think about this. So, if you can see the screen, the first question is what can be taught? And here, what I'd like to suggest is there's 3 different ways to think about this. And I know this partly by doing this work at the Kennedy School, but I think it's true of many other places as well. Firstly, we can think about the careers of people going into international development and who are going to be working on the SDGs. And for them, there are many issues there. Obviously things like poverty, clean water, HIV/AIDS. But incorporating the idea of electoral assistance, which is now mainstream in the international community, is an additional area that I think can really be worked on and can be focused on, particularly for what you might term professional policy analysis. So it's things like if people are going to work, for example, at UNDP, or at IFIS in DC, or USAID, or any of the other major agencies, for example in the regional world, like OAS, then knowing about electoral systems, what works, what doesn't work, to produce professional policy reports, I think is an important skill. Are we still good at showing the screen?
Yes.
Yes, we are, Graham.
Yep, still good. Marvelous. The second area is obviously for our students working in state and local government. And here, electoral management and administration has become so critical. And obviously that's partly the departments of state which are working on this in each different area. But then all the people working in local government as well, it's another area which is important for all of us. And there, what we're really training in some ways is basically electoral management, just like you think about electoral management for any other policy sector. And then lastly, there's the broader constituency. And so we're thinking about leadership, policy advocacy, and those who are going to pursue elected office. And here there's a range of active-oriented skills which are there for NGOs. Think about, for example, the groups working on electoral reform or gerrymandering in different states. Civic associations who are interested in these issues. Those who are going to pursue elected office and who are going to work within parties. Those who are going to comment on it in journalism or serve as posters or work on communications or as citizens. So those are three different career tracks. And I think in all of our work, exec head, MPAs, MPPs, and PhDs, they kind of cross-cut, and all of these are important. To give you an example, this is the sort of thing that we generate in my own project, which are designed for executive education classes, short intensive work, for model curricula. For example, we did one of those with International Idea on the prevention of violence that's designed for electoral management bodies, and for policy analysis reports. For example, challenges in sub-Saharan Africa, or working with EMB's electoral management bodies, like those in Australia, or the AWEB, which is a global agency working on this. So these are the kind of constituencies, and then the question is, why do we need to integrate electoral integrity now into the curriculum? So, just to show you some of the challenges, worldwide, this gives you some of the problems of what's changed. So, if we go back to the 1950s and 60s, there were many countries having elections, but what's changed, particularly with the third wave of democratization from the 1980s, is that more or less all countries worldwide, with the exception of only a handful, are now holding elections. But as you can see from this graph, which is from the Varieties of Democracy project, many of these contests are deeply flawed. Problems of money, problems of violence, problems of intimidation, issues of poor quality electoral administration, and the range that's going up with integrity is good as well, but then some are totally failed. And examples of completely failed elections, I think, will be the Kenyan election, which is about to be reheld, where the leader of the opposition, I think, says he's not going to participate, and there's going to be contention and conflict as a result of that. But other examples might be Turkey or Venezuela, or other countries which have got elections which have broken down. So many elections around the world have problems. And in addition, even in affluent, established democracies, the quality of elections is not good. And this isn't just a problem of America. We often like to think of it like that. We know about the issues of Russian meddling, of accusations of voter fraud, and of problems of voter suppression. But as this graph shows you, there are many other countries, including countries which are Anglo-American democracies. The United Kingdom has a very poor record. Australia, Canada. So even affluent countries get it wrong. And at home, in America, this gives you a little bit of the evidence for why it really matters nowadays in terms of public opinion and widespread beliefs about electoral fraud. A quarter of Americans, for example, in the inauguration, thought that millions are voting illegally. Partisan polarization is very great. Half of all Republicans believe Trump won the popular vote. And trust in American elections has fallen. For example, the Gallup World Poll, which has asked this on every year for a range of different countries, 120 countries. So when people are asked about the confidence and the honesty of their elections in America, in 2006, just as a decade ago, half were confident. Today, that's gone down to a third. So for all these reasons, I think if policy schools can do something to strengthen the quality of elections and to improve confidence in and trust in elections, then that would be a real service. Do that, I think, is an important opportunity, but we're still not sure about the detailed ways to proceed. And finally, before I hand over to our other speakers, let me just talk a little bit about my own experience on the Electoral Integrity Project. So if I still have a couple of minutes, we're still good? This is my project which I created and developed in 2012, well before so many of the problems which emerged in America, and I founded it, and it works both in Harvard and in Sydney University. You can find all the details about the project on our website, which is www.electoralintegrityproject.com. It's the name of the project.com. And here what we do is you can see the range of our work, which involves research on things like books, publications and policy reports, different data collection projects, like our year in election report, which has just come out just this week, events like our workshops, where we hold workshops normally twice a year, sometimes internationally, sometimes at home in conjunction with professional meetings, and our blog. So what we try to do, above all, is to use basically normative standards from the international community to define what we mean by electoral integrity, and then evidence-based policy to actually evaluate the quality of elections around the world. And just like the Corruption Perception Index, we publish this, and this is a new way to really diagnose where are the problems, and then how can countries themselves think about a range of reforms about what might work. And I'm going to jump to our latest evidence, just to give you a little flavour, and then I'll hand over to the rest of the panel. What do we actually know about the quality of elections around the world? Well, this is our latest results. So what we do, just like the Corruption Perception Index, is we do an expert survey which asks 40 experts in each country, 1 month after each election, about the quality of their own elections. We ask them 50 different questions, we integrate that into an index, and then we publish that, and we categorize our elections then in terms of very high quality, and you can see immediately that Scandinavia and Northern Europe does very well, so does Canada. We have countries which are high, and those are countries, for example, throughout Latin America, the southern cone of Africa, parts also of the Pacific and Mongolia, and also the United States falls into that category. And then moderate countries, which are okay, but problematic in certain regards, a case like India. And then we also have low and very low. And the very low countries, as you can see, particularly in Africa, whether they're problems of violence and threats, whether they're problems of vote buying and corruption, or whether they're problems of lack of electoral administration, lack of capacity to administer an election. But you can also see those problems, for example, in parts of Asia and in some of the Gulf states as well. So we try to analyze this, and then what we also do is, for example, we look around the world, and we're always looking by region, so countries can be ranked. And we can see that in every country, sorry, in every region around the world, some are doing remarkably well. If I take Africa, for example, obviously it's often seen as a problem, but there are cases, Cape Verde, Benin, Ghana, that we rate as doing really very well in electoral integrity. But there are also countries, of course, which are really problematic, such as Ethiopia, such as Burundi. So of all these countries, we can see that there are some countries doing well, some countries doing badly, and we can also say, what are the stages where are the greatest problems? And this is the world average. And you can immediately see that some countries, some problems rather, there's a pretty good record on the vote count and electoral procedures. But as you go down the list of different things, media coverage, campaign funding is a problem in many countries. So the conclusions, to draw it to a close, that I think we do need to integrate issues of electoral integrity into our work in policy schools in America and worldwide, in our executive education, in our master's programs, particularly those on international development, but also those on American politics, that these challenges are global, but they're also at home, And I think it's a useful set of skills for all sorts of careers, including for the SDGs, which is the topic of the panel, but also for many other areas, such as policy advocacy. But we're only starting to understand how to do this in practice, how to integrate it into our curriculum. And I really look forward to hearing from the other panelists how they see them as useful steps forward. You can find more details about my project and further resources which are available to download at Electoral Territory Project, and I look forward to hearing everybody else's comments. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you, Pippa, very much. Do we know, is Avery on board?
I'm gonna have to call her.
Okay.
Add the call for her now.
All right.
I just didn't want to interrupt.
Then we'll move.
You want to move to the next?
Well, do you need some time, or should?
I need a little time, so.
Well, let's go ahead then with the next, Bridget. He'll come up, and so she'll need access.
Nice when the technology works well.
Will Pippa still be able to hear us?
Yeah, I'm gonna leave it.
I can hear you well.
Good.
It's good.
Good, thank you. Pippa, this is Bridget King from Auburn University. You were not online when I introduced her earlier.
Nice to hear from you.
Which one of these do I click?
By the way, I did put my materials up on the shared conference facility. So if anybody wants to pull down in and they can see more details, obviously just a brief talk, they can, I think, go to our shared national conference and get down the PowerPoints.
Great. Are you able to?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Go.
Okay. Good afternoon. As Robert mentioned, I'm Bridget King, an assistant professor at Auburn. So what I'm going to talk to you about is a course at Auburn that's offered this semester that was spearheaded by one of my colleagues, Dr. Kelly Project. Kelly cannot be here with us today to talk about the project because she's actually in Liberia with the class, and they just finished observing their recent presidential election. So before I start talking about the project specifically, I'm going to provide you with a little background about Liberia. So Liberia experienced civil war from 1989 to 2003 and was classified as a failed state. It's worth noting that technically there were 2 civil wars, but the period between them was still rife with violence. During the civil wars, over 250,000 people died and 1.8 million were displaced. The war officially ended with the signing of the Accra Peace Agreement in 2003. And at this time, Liberia was completely destroyed, specifically all infrastructure, so hospitals, schools, and the government collapsed. Liberia was the 4th least developed country in the world at the end of the Civil War. It has been engaged in post-conflict redevelopment for over a decade. In 2011, Charles Taylor, Liberia's warlord president from 1997 to 2003, was formally convicted of war crimes and is currently serving a 50-year prison sentence. The Accra Peace Agreement signed the end of the conflict and the beginning of democratic consolidation. International observers, when it comes to their elections, deemed the 2005 and 2011 election as generally free, fair, and without major irregularities. Their current president, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, was elected the first female African head of state. And as she has served her 2nd term, according to the Constitution, she has to step down. And so because of that, 2017, the election is particularly important because it is the first peaceful post-war transition to power, and the transition of power, as we know, is an important marker for democratic consolidation, particularly in Liberia. All right, so this past election, which happened a few days ago, there were both presidential and legislative races. Of the races that occurred during the most recent election, the primary focus of this project and the course was the presidential race. due to its importance as a peaceful transition and further evidence of democratic consolidation. Liberia has a multi-party system with two main parties, the Unity Party and the Coalition for Democratic Change. The link that I'm not going to scroll through, but it's on the PowerPoint, is the National Election Commission of Liberia, where they basically host all of their election-related information. Here is an example of the 2011 presidential ballot. Photos in specific colors are typically used to help voters identify who the candidates are and who their parties are. This is particularly important as literacy is low and many of the voters aren't able to read. So with the colors and photos, they are able to identify both the candidates and the parties they represent. This brings us to Poly 6550, which is the course being offered at Auburn this semester. So the course is titled Public Administration, Civil Society, and Democracy. So given the importance of the 2017 election, it was an opportunity for the Auburn University MPA program to create a unique graduate course opportunity that combines part of our global public administration concentration and nonprofit certificate, and also our election administration concentration. So the class meets on the Auburn University campus, but students, when they signed up, were aware that one of the requirements was that they travel to Liberia for 2 weeks to observe the election and work with a nonprofit while there. So Poly 6550, over the course of the semester, students examine Liberia's history and background, the capacity of democratic institutions, and the role of public administration and civil society in Liberia's development. Course modules also include things like healthcare, so the Ebola crisis, and most importantly, relative to the project they're working on now, African elections. So in the syllabus, Kelly provides a core list of readings, and then the students collectively identify additional readings that will supplement those that she has identified, and also help them learn more about their more specific research interests. Each student then selects a research topic, formulates their topic to create an answerable research question, and then at the end of the semester, they will submit a research paper, which involves them doing semi-structured interviews with people while they are in Liberia. So using field assessment and qualitative data to answer their posed research question, like I said, they will produce a research paper at the end of the semester. So the assignments include applied and real-world projects. So while in Liberia, they are working directly with a Liberian NGO, the Hope Alliance, to assist with design and the launch of a website. They're also assisting with a half-day training workshop that will be delivered to 25 Liberian NGO workers. Over the course of the trip, the students will also visit 4 locations where a Liberian anti-corruption NGO works. They will observe and participate in their work. And lastly, the AU MPA group has been certified by the National Elections Commission of Liberia as international elections observers. And so what they're currently doing is performing a short-term election observation in Nimba County, Liberia, at the border of Guinea and Sierra Leone. All right, so here is just the actual certification of the Auburn University MPA program group as international election observers. So prior to leaving for the trip, the students were required to engage in an in-class learning module about what they would be doing as election observers. The election observation training materials were from international observation that are typically used in West Africa. The students created an election observation checklist based on best practices. And the students the plan was for them to go to at least 5 polling places. I believe they actually went to 6. And at the end, they will synthesize their data and send a report to the Liberian National Election Commission. And so here's a copy of what the checklist looks like. But some of the questions are, were all the materials at the polling location when you arrived? Which polling place staff was present? Did the presiding official appear to be well trained? What time was the polling site ready to receive votes? So did it open on time? What was your overall evaluation of the atmosphere inside the polling location and outside the polling location? Did they witness people with disabilities trying to vote? Were there necessary resources for them? Were there tribal authorities present? And then also they're asked to check off any problems that they identified at the polling site that might not be listed specifically throughout the questions. So for the course, there are some outcomes or student learning outcomes related to election observation. One of them being to understand the difference between election monitoring and election observation, and to understand why election observation is important, specifically in Western Africa. So obviously observation can increase civic engagement, accountability and trust between citizens and government, prevent conflict, and also deter or detect fraud and irregularities. And all of these learning outcomes come specifically from the training materials that the students were required to utilize and learn. Other outcomes, understanding the process of election and election observation, so thinking about short-term versus long-term, differences that might exist between election observation in the United States versus other nations, and phases of the electoral cycle. The students are also to learn and apply best practices related to election observation, so ethical and professional observation, creating the election observation checklist, which I just shared with you, the implementation of election day observation at various polling places in Nimba County, which I'll show you shortly, and to finally synthesize their findings in a final report. So here are just some photos. So this is a photo of some campaign activities that actually took place at a rally during 2011. So in Liberia, all campaign activities stop 48 hours prior to the election, and that 48-hour period is known as the period of reflection. Here is a line outside a polling location in Painesville, a community just outside the capital of Monrovia. So it's worth noting that October, is the end of the rainy season, and so conditions are dismal and roads become washed out and impassable, which I'll show you shortly in a short little video. And so voting materials are often delivered on foot or by canoe in some areas of the country because the roads become washed out and cars cannot pass by them. And it's worth noting that citizens in Liberia take the right to vote very seriously, often waiting in line for many hours, often having started to line up prior to the sun even coming up. And so here are some photos from where our students are now. So that's Dr. Krawcheck, that's Kelly, in her official election observer t-shirt. Here is a photo of the 4 students who she took to Liberia to engage in the election observation activities. Here's just some sort of remember to vote information or flyers that are posted by the National Elections Commission. Here is the ballot from the 2017 election, and you can clearly see, well not clearly see, but you can see the people's faces in addition to their party symbols to the left. Here is a line of individuals waiting to vote outside of their polling location, and there is another polling location. And so the last thing I want to share with you is a very short video, if I can. It's short, it's 2 minutes. Oh my gosh, this is worse. It's not working.
Can you see this, Peppa?
I can, but can't do it directly.
Can you see the screen?
I can.
Okay.
Oh, there we go.
There we go. Sorry about that.
You're fine.
do we have Avery on, or should we?
Avery should be on the phone. I just want to check something.
Avery, are you on?
Just hold on.
Avery, are you still on?
Comes through here.
Oh,
Avery, can you hear me?
yep, there she is. She's on. You just need to talk into the microphone and talk to her.
I'm going to be handing you over to the moderator.
Yeah. Avery, we got a little out of sync on the schedule with the technology issues, but you're on next, and we look forward to hearing from you. Is she going to be presented on this visible up here? Oh, okay, so just speak.
Hey, Mushkin, this is going to work. It's a little strange.
Breaking up.
So I'm talking and
You're breaking up. Hold on a second.
so now.
Just hold it a minute, Avery, while we try to get this figured out.
I'm gonna recall her again.
Okay, tell you what, let's do. Avery, if you don't mind, we're gonna go ahead with the next presentation while we get this technology straightened out. Okay? I'll take that. Okay. Come on.
Great. Well, I think it's interesting in this discussion today, thinking about how we expect election management bodies to get technology perfect every day. We can see that it's a challenge here as we're doing this. What I wanted to do very quickly was to discuss, I was asked to give some examples. And let me say before I start, I'm going to give you examples of maladministrations, of mistakes. I don't want that to undermine the unbelievable work that election management bodies do around the world. It's a very difficult job. Nobody really wants it, but it's very important. And so I think it's very easy to focus on the mistakes they make and forget all the good work that they do. I had a colleague who I worked with for a very long time, Rafael Lopez Pintor, who started working in this field many, many years ago. And he always wanted there to be a master's program and a professional approach to election administration, to develop a high duty of care for professionals, and he would be very happy to see that this is a discussion that's happening here today. IFAS, if you don't know IFAS, just very quickly, we're a nonprofit international NGO. We have over 30 years of experience. We worked in over 145 countries, and what we really do is focus on election administration and providing technical assistance to election management bodies. For election integrity, IFAS does have an election integrity assessment methodology in which we look at 18 different aspects of the entire electoral process to try to identify vulnerabilities for fraud, malpractice, and systemic manipulation, which I'll talk about very quickly. I've highlighted some of these that are very close to public policy or public administration issues in which if there's maladministration, if there's not professional conduct of elections, they can have huge effects on the trust in elections and outcome, which I will give examples shortly. We've done our integrity assessment in several countries. I've listed them here. Afghanistan will be the third one coming up shortly. As you can imagine, the fraud and malpractice vulnerabilities in a place like Afghanistan is very, very large. We also did the Gambia recently, which I'll give an example of, which is a really interesting process. Again, when we look at the integrity, we look at those different 18 aspects that I listed there. We want to make a distinction between fraud, which is when somebody deliberately tries to change the outcome of the election, and systemic manipulation is when the law is written to change the outcome of elections. A good example is in Burma, where there's a law that sets aside 25% of the seats for the military. There's nothing that a public administrator can do about that. We also would say that the gerrymandering in the United States would fit into that category. So what I'm going to really focus on is malpractice. and that is a breach by a professional of his or her relative duty of care resulting from carelessness or neglect. And I think that's what this discussion and this education will be about. What is a duty of care of an election administrator, and how should we measure that? And should it be higher than would be just a normal administration job? Now, when we look at integrity, this is a slide from our Sri Lanka integrity assessment findings. We look at the vulnerability of mistake, like how likely is it that mistake could happen, and if it's not addressed, how much of an impact will it have on the overall election outcome. And we do that to allow policymakers and election management officials to try to prioritize and think about what they should focus on and what they should do, which has been very helpful in many places in which we work. Now, I want to just give you a very few examples of where a small mistake can have a huge impact on the overall trust and results of an election. In 2009, elections in Indonesia took place. Elections in Indonesia are incredibly difficult to administer. There are 260 million people plus. There are almost 18,000 islands that they need to reach. And so the election commission is underfunded, understaffed, and they have this huge job to do. In 2009, because of the difficulty in trying to get results in from the islands, they tried to put in place an optical scan machine that would scan ballots, or the results forms actually, not the ballots, to try to be able to broadcast results into Jakarta quickly. Seems easy enough. But when you talk about public administration, the elections were in April. They didn't award the contract until March. Procurement and that process in an election system and procuring election equipment and other services is also an area for corruption in many of the places in which we work. It's something that needs to be highly monitored and professionalized. They weren't able to train their operators properly. And what happened on election day was when they went to go scan the results forms, they found that the actual paper that they procured for the results forms was so thin to save money that when they put the results form in the scanner, it just ate it up. And so the results system never worked. They spent, the US government spent over $2.7 billion. The Indonesian government spent several $million, and because of some of these very small mistakes, they weren't intentional, only 10% of the results were gathered via this system. And luckily in 2009, there was a huge margin of victory, so it didn't really cause an outroar. But in 2014, it was a very, very close election. And the KPU had actually corrected most of these problems, and through public administration and decent administration, they actually were able to pull off a very, very good election in 2014. The Gambia. This is very interesting in that if you don't know this, they vote with marbles. When you can see these little boxes and the little tube on top, you go behind a curtain and you drop a marble into the bucket. And then at the end of the day, you can see this form that they use. They just put the marbles out on this tray, and it's a very easy way to count. And they trust it, and they use it there. And people really do trust it, understand it, and it works well. We didn't think we would say that when we went to go observe it. One interesting thing is when you drop the marble in the bucket, a little bell rings, like a bell on a bike. So there's a provision in the law that outlaws the use of bells on your bike on that day. But one thing that happened in 2016 is President Jumaya, who was in office for 22 years, had lost the election, and he was willing to stand down. But during the results counting process, they found a minor error in the Excel spreadsheet in which they were tabulating results. And so Jumaya, based on that one mistake, retracted his concession and almost tried to challenge the election, and it luckily through international pressure he did step down. But again, one mistake through public administration, one employee makes a mistake and the whole country could be on edge. Kenya, which has been consuming my life recently, what's really interesting, and I won't go into the court findings, the law there basically said that the court had to overturn the elections if there were mistakes or if there was outcome determinative fraud, not both. And so when the court did find that the results transmission system didn't work properly, that the forms weren't completely filled out properly, that the stamps weren't put on the forms properly, And the Election Commission only had 2 weeks to be able to provide the evidence to the court to show that they administered the elections properly, and they couldn't do so in the limited amount of time. The court had to overturn the elections and annul the elections, which has triggered an unbelievable number of other questions of who's registered to vote for the next election, which candidates are registered to vote, et cetera, that we're dealing with. But again, it was just the administration of the results transmission system that caused this problem. If there was more transparency and it was done professionally, we probably wouldn't have had the problem that we had. If they could have produced the evidence in a timely manner, we wouldn't have had the problem that we have. Now, the United States doesn't get off easily either. Most recently, in preparation for PIPA's last conference, a colleague and I looked at the US system. And of course, there's major issues here, which we all understand. Some of the findings are that 2.75 million individuals are registered in more than one state. There are 1.8 million deceased individuals on voters' lists. There's 12.7 million outdated voter records. And it's because the states aren't talking to each other. There's a number of reasons why. I don't think it's not intentional, but it's because of some of the administration of these systems and outdated technology, the lack of resources, et cetera. Part of what we did for our research, which I found interesting, is we asked international experts on election administration factual questions, and we also asked US election administrators factual questions. For example, there's no federal election management body that oversees the entire electoral process, was a question. And then we asked to rate that from very negative to very positive and the differences in between. As you can see, the US administrators, 64%, said that this was a positive or very positive statement, where international experts, 85% said this was somewhat negative or very negative. And we found many of these discrepancies between the way Americans see an electoral process and international standards. And a lot of it has to do with some of the administrative processes in which we see. And so my last point that I'd like to make is that I think this idea of professionalizing administration, and again, I go back to my original statement, that we have to thank the people who are willing to do this job, because it's a difficult job. You're going to be judged on your mistakes and probably not on your successes. And we have to give people the tools to be able to do it properly. But part of what we need to provide are comparative examples so that we can see how other countries have done things and how they've improved the process. Because in a way, I think the United States has a bit of a blind spot in that we do not try to learn from other nations in regards to election administration. And we do think that some of the ways in which we do things are proper when maybe they are not. So that's my presentation today, and I'll turn it over to the panel.
Thank you very much. So,
Avery just logged on, he's talking.
Avery, are you there? Avery? Just hang on a minute.
Sorry, I heard the login thing go, Avery, before, as he was speaking. Do you want to move to the next speaker, or?
I probably need to, but she's not just waiting right there.
If I had her connected, I think she lost the phone connection.
Okay, give it time, Doug, if you'll, and if then we get her at the end, we'll bring her on.
Thank you, Robert.
Avery.
Hi, Avery, are you on?
I'm trying. Is this working?
Now it's working. Avery, it's
Am I
Doug.
deafening you now?
No, you are not deafening me. Go ahead and
Yes.
do your thing.
Oh gosh, okay, so, hello everyone. Oh, I think there's a terrible echo for me, so I apologize. And I apologize about just everything that everyone has said, so this is going to be entirely a vacuum and maybe, I don't know. But thank you for taking the time to include me in the panel, and hopefully we'll be able to get through a couple of minutes together.
Can't you just call her over the phone?
We lost you again. Avery, we lost you, I'm afraid.
I got it.
It's a pretty small group. Maybe we could just huddle around a telephone.
Hey,
Can
Robert.
you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, you're back.
Hello?
Go ahead, Avery.
Hello?
Hello. We're having a little
Can you hear
difficulty,
me
but
buttoning sound, and I'm not sure if that means there are people there still, or if it's just talking. Thinking to myself. Okay, I'm gonna hang up, I'm gonna try one more time. Maybe it'll work.
Yeah.
can you hear me now?
Robert, let me do 2 quick minutes and then we'll
Yeah,
hopefully
okay,
get
go
Avery
ahead.
back. Wonderful. Well, I'm going to apologize to everybody, including the AV guy. I don't have slides. I don't have a video. I'm not calling in. I'm just going to give you the live show. So really very briefly, because I want to save time for Avery if she makes it back. I work at the University of Minnesota, where a couple of years ago we established an online certificate in election administration, initially for master's level students and now including undergraduate level students. And the goal there was to take the same ideals of public administration as a profession and bring them to the practice of election administration. And so a lot of the work we do is taking scholarship and experience from public administration and bringing it to election administration. What's exciting to me about this project, about the work that's going on around the world and increasingly here in the United States, is an opportunity to take some of the things that we're doing in elections and bring them to public administration and public service more generally. One of the things that a lot of people don't seem to realize is that, at least in this country, voting is often one of, if not the only, face-to-face interaction that citizens have with their government. Unless they have the misfortune to get a traffic ticket or something else, often interacting with the election office, either at the polling place or otherwise, is the only experience they have. And so the better experience they have, the more confidence they have in the outcome. And so to the extent that we can take that same focus on participation and transparency and accountability and export that from election administration to public administration, I think the better off we'll be. We're already starting to see that in the field. I do a lot of work with election administrators across the country. For example, there's a project that's known as the Voting Information Project, where voters can enter an address and get information on where they vote, what's on their ballot, and the deadlines and rules for casting their ballot. That same kind of geographically based access to information is increasingly of interest in other areas as well. And so in some ways, election administrators, instead of being sort of caboose on the public administration train, are the tip of the spear. And to the extent that we can use this same focus on participation in the election realm and bring it to a deeper public appreciation for and understanding of public service and the various public agencies with which they interact on a day-to-day basis, that's really exciting. Obviously, we are still early days on this effort, but I think that's worth commending, it's worth following, and I know that at least those of us at Minnesota and many of my colleagues across the country are looking forward to putting our shoulder to the wheel. Shakespeare said, "Brevity is the very soul of wit." I am nothing if not a fan of Shakespeare. Thank you for your time, and hopefully we've still got a little bandwidth for Avery. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So what's the status?
If she joins, you would have heard her name, Avery, again. I could call that one more time and see if she got back on.
See you. Well, when she does, just interrupt me. I'll begin taking questions or comments from the audience. I'd like to say first, I think it's a really neat thing that we're all here, of the various groups in the world, certainly various groups in the United States, who recognize issues of election administration and are trying to do something about it in this country and around the world. For the most part, are represented right here in one form or another. And so it's really great to interact with all of you. I see Pippa nodding her head, so that must mean she agrees, not surprisingly. And I think it's a great thing. Are there questions or comments? I would, oh, here's one.
I'll ask a question about, this is to either of the programs that focus on election administration. How do you feel the younger generation who are taking the MPA classes are approaching the certificates and the programs? Are they coming into it with any perspectives that surprised you or that are different than maybe how you drew up the programs, particularly at Wisconsin?
Oh, so I mean, I guess for me, the one thing I would say is I think students are surprised about the complexity that is elections in the United States. You know, as a citizen, you go, you register, you vote, it's over. And sort of, so, you know, sort of understanding the back end of what's happening after the election and all the processes and procedures that have to take place prior to the election, I think students have found those surprising. I think, at least at Auburn, when students realize what a vast field election administration is and all the professional opportunities there are in these, specifically at the state or local level, it's an area that many students don't actually consider. And once discovered, they realize, you know, how many opportunities there are for them to grow professionally. I mean, I think, and I don't know if you find anything different, but I think as a field, election administration is kind of one of the best kept secrets. And so as more programs have certificates or concentrations that are specifically focused on election administration, my hope is that we'll see more and more people post-college deciding to pursue this area and get more and more professional, and principles of administration more broadly will sort of embed themselves in election administration, or vice versa.
Yeah, actually, let me pile onto that. I think that the one thing that we have discovered is that in many ways the barrier to entry to the field is lowered, but the other thing we're discovering is that there are way more doorways. So it used to be you would come to elections because you were interested in politics and government, and more we're seeing people interested in design, or in democracy, or in the law, or in access for people with disabilities or traditionally underrepresented populations. And so what I tell students is the great thing about election administration is that pretty much anything you like to do, there's a role for you in the election sphere. So we end up, in addition to the master's level students, we get practitioners and folks from the field who come from what I call adjacent professions. Again, designers, lawyers, advocates, what have you. And in some ways, they've discovered that understanding the election administration process is either interesting to them or crucial to their understanding of how they do their job in the American electoral sphere. And so what we're trying to do, and I know programs like Auburn are doing as well, is opening those doors so that folks from whatever background they come have a better understanding for and pathway into the profession.
And we'll jump ahead here. Pippa's got a comment, then I'll come back to you. Yes, ma'am.
So, one thing we should mention is that at the international community, can you hear me?
I can barely hear you, but they can. I'll try to repeat. Go ahead.
The international community has tried to create distance learning through a program called Bridge, which is funded by many agencies. And I think there can be great synergy between the certificates that are taught in America and some of the Bridge initiatives for professionals. But it'd be great to share syllabi.
Wonderful idea. The idea that there are programs around internationally that are doing this kind of work, and it would be great, and a lot of it online, I think you said, right, Pippa?
That's right.
Yeah,
Online.
and her suggestion is we should share syllabi and we should be talking to each other, which is, I see this panel as a step in that direction. Now, you had a question.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. My question is regarding corruption in elections. So given the panel's experiences monitoring elections, definitely there's so many different forms of corruption that do take place while elections are held. So again, based on your experiences, what are the best techniques to fight these forms of corruption, whether it's bribery, whether it's a favor, whatever, name it. How do you actually manage to stop these forms of corruption? Best practices, maybe.
It's interesting in that I was at a meeting that I came from before I was here was meeting with USAID to discuss this in particular, and unfortunately it's complicated. And I think in elections, international elections anyway, I think there was overt fraud that happened on election day, ballot stuffing, intimidation, and that sort of thing still happens. But I think much of that now has shifted before and after the election. So it could be restricting candidacy, writing the law in a way in which doesn't allow candidates to run or to manipulate the process beforehand. And then there's also some type of manipulation in the results transmission process. So I think as you professionalize and you do actual observation, I think you can start to address those issues. But then you get into issues of use of state resources and a whole host, and then the prosecution of anybody who does commit crime. In many places in which we work, when there has been corruption or fraud identified, nobody very often is anybody actually prosecuted. So what's the remedy and the deterrence for it? It's a tough question. I wish we had an answer to it. Each country is going to be specific in where the fraud and the corruption exists, but you're going to have to tailor your approach to it depending upon the system and what is actually happening. I don't know if Pippa has anything to add.
It's complicated.
It's complicated, absolutely. Let me make a comment that you know, one of the things, and I've heard this from the U.S. Justice Department as well, if you have multiple people looking at the system who A, know what is supposed to happen and can identify fraud, and B, know what to do if they find it, which is always a question, I think it does a lot to eliminate or even preclude a lot of these actions. And I can give, if you have time, I'll give you some stories from the United States to that effect, but I won't take the time right now. Did you have another comment, Doug?
Yeah, and I guess I don't have the international experience that Chad and Robert do. My experience in the United States, I don't want to say that there's no corruption, but I think Hanlon's razor applies in the United States. Usually the problems are misfeasance rather than malfeasance. It's either it's a mistake or a lack of resources leads to a problem. Again, I don't want to say that there aren't people out there, you know, so-called black hats who are trying to actively corrupt the process, but more often than not, it's a misfeasance, and so. But that's just as pernicious because the result, in some ways, you can't prosecute a bad guy. You have to fix the problem. And so I think the way you identify either of those is through multiple sets of eyes. We're seeing an increasing interest in, very belated interest in the field in performance-related measures. You're starting to see states and localities requiring post-election audits. Right now, mostly of the machinery, but there's increasing interest in sort of a broader performance audit of elections as well. Where there are high stakes, there will always be people looking to cut corners. But to the extent that we can at least stamp out the obvious unforced errors, I think we go a long way toward making the system make it work the way it should.
Other questions? Yes. So you're putting your glasses on. Okay. Other questions, comments? Pippa, do you have anything? Oh, wait a minute.
How can we kind of continue the dialogue?
I'm sorry, what?
How can we continue the dialogue?
How can we, that's a very good question. How can we continue this dialogue? I think that's a great, and we at least have each other's email addresses now. And no, I think that's a very good point. I think when we get back, I'll send you all an email and suggest we start talking to each other.
We also have an election administration section
right
at NASPA. Anyone who's not a member of that section who would like to join, please see us.
That would be great.
And we also are launching the election administration commons in the fall of 2018 for sharing curricular resources.
Yeah, exactly. There was a question in the
Maybe I wanted to ask Bill if the foundation has studies on elections at the local level. You mentioned elections or presidential elections mostly. Have you studied local elections and have you found any differences in the countries that you are helping?
It's a very, very, very good question. the international community so many times focuses on a presidential election. However, in most places in which we work, the actual distribution of income, power, whatnot is happening at the local level. But there's very little international attention that is paid at that level. So when we're looking, particularly the abuse of state resources, the use of facilities, vehicles, people, money to manipulate the elections, it's far worse at the local level than the larger level. So it's a problem in that we don't have the money resources to focus on it, but I do think it's where a lot of vulnerability happens.
Comments? Thank you all. Let's do try to stay in touch. If people are interested about this, chime in, and I think it's a good idea. Thank you all.